Chapter 1, Shadows on 42nd Street. New York City was a beehive of activity, bustling as usual beneath the shadow of towering skyscrapers. Morning light slanted across 42nd Street, glinting off the glass and steel structures that seemed to stretch forever into the sky. The usual chaos of horns honking, pedestrians shuffling, and vendors calling out their wares filled the air. But on this particular day, the hum of the city was broken by something darker. Leroy Matthews had been sitting at the corner of the street for hours. His clothes were tattered, his body gaunt, and his mind worn from years of hardship. His once proud stance as a high school teacher had long since crumbled under the weight of unemployment, addiction, and the harsh realities of homelessness. He had no family to turn to, no safety net to catch him as he fell further into the abyss. For Leroy, life on the streets was more than just survival, it was a constant battle against the cruel judgments of society. He had seen it all, the looks of disdain, the insults whispered behind his back, and the occasional act of violence from those who saw him as less than human. But today was different. Today, Leroy's world would collide with two officers of the law, and nothing would ever be the same. Sergeant Bill Henderson and Officer Jake Stevens were on their usual morning patrol when they spotted Leroy. He was slumped against the side of a building, mumbling incoherently, his eyes wild and distant. To the untrained eye, Leroy looked dangerous. His erratic movements and disheveled appearance suggested someone who had lost touch with reality. "There's another one," Stevens muttered under his breath as they approached. "Bet he's high." Henderson, the more experienced of the two, gave a noncommittal grunt. He had seen this scenario play out countless times before. The homeless population was growing, and with it came a host of challenges for the NYPD. Drugs, mental illness, violence, it all seemed to blur together in a sea of hopelessness. But something about this man, this broken figure huddled on the sidewalk, made Henderson pause. "Let's take it slow," he said quietly to Stevens. "We don't know what's going on here." But Stevens was already on edge. He was younger, newer to the force, and his experiences had shaped him into someone who saw danger around every corner. In his mind, the sight of a black man, homeless and seemingly out of control, triggered a sense of fear and distrust. "Sir, you need to move along," Stevens called out, his voice stern but lacking empathy. Leroy didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a haze of memories that blurred the lines between past and present. The attack the night before had left him dazed and confused, unable to distinguish between reality and the nightmares that haunted him. "I said, move along." Stevens repeated, his hand instinctively hovering over the holster at his side. Henderson stepped forward, his gut telling him something was off. "Jake, take it easy," he muttered. "He's not responding, might be hurt." But Stevens wasn't listening. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. To him, this was another potential threat, another situation that could spiral out of control in a heartbeat. Suddenly, Leroy stumbled to his feet, his hands shaking as he reached out toward the officers. His eyes were wide with fear, his voice a broken whisper. "Don't hurt me," he mumbled. "Please, don't." Stevens saw the movement and reacted. In an instant, he drew his baton, stepping forward to subdue the perceived threat. But Leroy wasn't attacking, he was reaching out for help, desperate for someone to see beyond the surface of his broken exterior. "Jake, wait!" Henderson shouted, but it was too late. Leroy screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed down the street. In a flash, both officers had him on the ground, their weight pressing down on his fragile frame. Blood from his previous injuries smeared the pavement, and the crowd that had gathered around watched in stunned silence. Chapter 2, The Misunderstanding. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Leroy's wrists, Stevens stood up, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking, his mind still racing with the adrenaline of the moment. But as he looked down at the man they had just subdued, a gnawing sense of doubt began to creep in. "He wasn't fighting," Henderson said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "He was scared." Stevens didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was a jumble of conflicting emotions, fear, guilt, and confusion. Had they made a mistake? Had they let their assumptions cloud their judgment? the crowd around them had grown larger, and the murmur of voices began to rise. People were pulling out their phones, recording the scene. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, Stevens felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. A woman pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes wide with outrage. "What are you doing?" she shouted. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just sitting there. Her words cut through the chaos like a knife. Henderson looked up at her, his expression grim. "Ma'am, please step back," he said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "We're trying to maintain order." "Order," she scoffed. "This man needs help, not a beatdown." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Stevens felt his chest tighten. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were supposed to protect and serve, but now it felt like they had done the opposite. Chapter 3, The Ripple Effect. The arrest of Leroy Matthews was a spark that ignited a firestorm of controversy. By the end of the day, the video of his arrest had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. Headlines screamed of police brutality, racial profiling, and the ongoing struggles of the homeless population. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. At the precinct, Henderson and Stevens sat in a small, dimly lit office, the weight of the day's events hanging heavy in the air. Detective Grace Powell, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for fairness, stood in front of them, arms crossed as she listened to their account of the incident. "You're telling me this man didn't pose a threat, but you still took him down like that?" Powell's voice was calm, but there was an edge of disbelief in her tone. "He wasn't responding to our commands," Stevens said defensively. "I thought he was about to attack." Powell raised an eyebrow. "And did he?" Stevens hesitated. "No, but he could have." Henderson leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Look, we made a mistake. I see that now. But in the moment, it felt like the right call. We were trying to protect ourselves." Powell sighed, rubbing her temples. "You two are in deep water. This isn't just about an arrest gone wrong, it's about how the public sees us, how they see the NYPD. This video is everywhere, and people are demanding answers." Henderson nodded grimly. "What do we do?" "We start by fixing this," Powell said firmly. "You're going to meet with Leroy. You're going to apologize, and you're going to listen to him. No excuses, no justifications. Just listen." Chapter 4, Facing the Truth. In the holding cell, Leroy sat hunched over, his head resting in his hands. His body ached, both from the attack the night before and the rough handling by the officers. But more than the physical pain, it was the emotional toll that weighed heavily on him. He had always known that people saw him as less than. Being a black man in America was hard enough, but being homeless, that was a whole different level of invisibility. People passed him on the street every day without so much as a glance, as if he didn't exist. And when they did notice him, it was with fear, disgust, or pity. He had grown used to it. But today had been different. Today, the system had crushed him in a way he hadn't expected. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cell block, and Leroy looked up to see two familiar faces, Henderson and Stevens. They stood awkwardly at the entrance to his cell, their expressions a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. "Leroy," Henderson began, his voice soft, "we're here to talk." Leroy didn't respond at first. He wasn't sure what to say. What could he say to the men who had just treated him like an animal, who had seen him as nothing more than a threat? "We made a mistake," Henderson continued, stepping closer. "We let our assumptions get the better of us, and for that, I'm sorry." Leroy's eyes flickered with surprise. An apology? From a cop? He had never expected that. Stevens cleared his throat, his voice less steady than his partner's. "We shouldn't have treated you like that. You didn't deserve it." For a long moment, the three men stood in silence. Leroy could feel the weight of their words pressing down on him, but he wasn't ready to let go of the anger just yet. "You saw me as a threat," Leroy said quietly. "Just because of the way I look. Because I'm black. Because I'm homeless." Henderson nodded slowly. I won't deny that. We were wrong. But I'm asking for a chance to make it right. Leroy looked into Henderson's eyes, searching for something, sincerity, perhaps, or maybe just a hint of understanding. And for the first time in a long time, he saw it. These men weren't perfect, but they were trying. And in a world that so often refused to acknowledge its mistakes, that meant something. Chapter 5, Reconciliation. In the weeks that followed, the incident on 42nd Street became a turning point for the city. The public outrage had forced the NYPD to confront its deep-seated issues with racial profiling and the treatment of the homeless population. Reforms were promised, and new training programs were implemented to help officers better handle situations involving vulnerable individuals like Leroy, but for Henderson and Stevens, the real work had only just begun. They didn't just apologize to Leroy and walk away. Instead, they committed themselves to learning from their mistakes. They began working with local outreach programs, spending time with the homeless community and listening to their stories. They learned about the struggles these individuals faced, the lack of mental health services, the systemic racism that kept them trapped in poverty, and the daily battle for dignity in a world that so often denied them even that. Leroy, too, found himself on a new path. With the help of a local nonprofit, he was able to get off the streets and into temporary housing. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of his past threatened to pull him back under. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a chance, a real chance, to rebuild his life. Chapter 6, Moving forward. Months later, Leroy stood on the stage of a community event, his hands shaking as he held the microphone. He had been invited to speak about his experience, to share his story with the world. The crowd in front of him was filled with familiar faces, activists, volunteers, and even a few police officers, including Henderson and Stevens. I used to think that the world didn't see me, Leroy began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I used to think that people like me didn't matter. But I was wrong. We all matter. And we all deserve to be treated with dignity. The crowd applauded, and Leroy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words sink in. He looked out at the faces before him and saw hope, not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been overlooked and forgotten. We can't change the past, he continued, but we can learn from it. And that's what matters. As he stepped off the stage, Leroy was met by Henderson and Stevens. The three men exchanged a look that spoke of understanding, of forgiveness, and of a shared desire to do better. And in that moment, they knew that change was possible. Not just for them, but for the city, and for everyone who had ever felt the weight of assumptions pressing down on them. Chapter 7, The Struggle for Redemption. In the aftermath of Leroy's speech, life moved forward. But for both Leroy and the officers, the journey toward redemption was far from over. While they had taken steps in the right direction, the complexities of systemic injustice were far deeper than any single apology or reconciliation. Sergeant Henderson and Officer Stevens found themselves at the heart of the NYPD's new initiative to rebuild trust within the community. The training seminars they helped organize were filled with other officers, some willing to listen, others resistant to change. It was a difficult process, requiring them to confront not only their own biases but also those embedded in the culture of law enforcement. The meetings were intense, often devolving into heated discussions about race, power, and authority. Some officers, much like Stevens had once been, were defensive, unwilling to accept the notion that their actions could be influenced by unconscious biases. Others, like Henderson, were more open, having seen firsthand how easy it was to make snap judgments in the heat of the moment. "You can't change everyone," Stevens muttered one day after a particularly tense session. They had been discussing the department's long history of profiling, and one of the younger officers had stormed out, unwilling to listen. "I know," Henderson replied, his voice heavy. "But if we don't try, nothing changes." Stevens nodded, the weight of the situation sitting on his shoulders. He had grown since that day on 42nd Street, but he knew he still had a long way to go. Chapter 8, Leroy's New Beginning. Leroy's life had taken a different turn. Thanks to the support he received, he was no longer sleeping on the streets. He had moved into transitional housing, a small but clean apartment where he could finally feel safe. It wasn't much, but for Leroy, it was a monumental step that he had reconnected with old acquaintances from his teaching days, some of whom had been shocked to learn what had become of him. They had helped him find therapy, get back on his feet, and slowly rebuild his sense of self-worth. The shame he once felt about his homelessness had begun to lift, replaced by a growing sense of pride in his survival, but Leroy's heart was still heavy. He had seen too much suffering on the streets to forget those he had left behind. His friends, the ones who still slept under bridges, who rummaged through garbage cans for food, remained in his thoughts. Leroy knew that while his life was improving, many others were still trapped in the same cycle of poverty and despair. With this in mind, Leroy began volunteering at the very nonprofit that had helped him. He spent his days helping others navigate the complex and often frustrating bureaucracy required to get off the streets. He listened to their stories, offered a shoulder to cry on, and shared his own experience in hopes of inspiring others. One afternoon, as he sat in the office filling out paperwork, he looked up to see a familiar face at the door. "Officer Stevens," Leroy said, a hint of surprise in his voice. Stevens smiled awkwardly. "I thought I'd stop by. See how things are going." Leroy gestured to the small, cluttered office. "Busy, as you can see. A lot of people need help." Stevens nodded, stepping inside. "I wanted to talk to you about something. We've been working on this initiative, Henderson and me, to address the issues with how the police interact with the homeless community. We want to get your input. You've lived through it, and I think the department could learn a lot from your perspective." Leroy raised an eyebrow, unsure of how to respond. "You want me to work with the police?" Stevens scratched the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I know it sounds strange, but I think you could really help. If we're going to change things, we need people like you to guide us." Leroy leaned back in his chair, considering the offer. He had never imagined that he would find himself working with the police, especially after what had happened. But then again, if there was a chance to make a real difference, to help others like him avoid the same fate, could he really say no? "All right," Leroy said slowly. "I'll give it a shot." Chapter 9. Bridging the divide. In the months that followed, Leroy became an unlikely advocate for change within the NYPD. He attended meetings, spoke at panels, and worked closely with Henderson, Stevens, and others who were dedicated to creating a more compassionate approach to policing. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of officers who resented the idea of taking advice from a homeless man. But Leroy persisted, knowing that real change would take time. At first, Leroy was met with skepticism. Many officers, like Stevens once had, viewed homeless individuals as dangerous, unpredictable, and a drain on city resources. Leroy understood this mindset. He had lived it, after all, but he also knew that these perceptions were rooted in ignorance and fear. One of the most difficult moments came when Leroy stood in front of a room full of officers and recounted the events of that fateful day on 42nd Street. He spoke honestly about his fear, about how he had felt dehumanized and powerless in the face of authority. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," Leroy said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here to make you understand. I'm here to tell you that the people you see on the streets, people like me, we're not just a problem for you to deal with. We're human beings, and we deserve to be treated like it." The room was silent for a long moment. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others listened intently. Henderson watched from the back of the room, his heart heavy with pride for the man who had once been the subject of their mistakes. Chapter 10. The ripple effect. As time went on, Leroy's work began to bear fruit. Slowly but surely, the culture within the NYPD started to shift. The training programs became more focused on empathy and understanding, and officers were encouraged to see the homeless population as individuals with unique stories and struggles. Henderson and Stevens continued to lead the charge, but they knew that the real credit belonged to Leroy. His bravery in confronting the system that had once failed him had inspired not only the police force but the entire city. Leroy's advocacy didn't stop at the police department. He began working with city officials to push for more funding for homeless shelters, mental health services, and affordable housing. His voice, once silenced by the harsh realities of life on the streets, had become a powerful force for change. Chapter 11, A Shared Future. One chilly evening, Leroy stood on the rooftop of a downtown building, overlooking the city that had once swallowed him whole. The lights of New York stretched out before him, a sea of possibility that no longer seemed so distant. Beside him stood Henderson and Stevens, the three men bound by an experience that had transformed them all. "We've come a long way," Stevens said quietly, his breath visible in the cold air. Leroy nodded. "But there's still a long way to go." Henderson smiled, the lines of his face deepening with age but also with the wisdom of hard-earned experience. "The important thing is that we're moving forward. Together." Leroy turned to look at them both, his heart full. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be working with the NYPD to help change things. But I'm glad I stuck around long enough to see it." As the three men stood there, looking out over the city, they knew that their journey was far from over. But they also knew that they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had the support of a growing movement dedicated to making New York a better, more compassionate place for everyone. And in that moment, the divide that had once seemed insurmountable between them had finally begun to close. Chapter 12, The Road Ahead. As the months turned into years, Leroy's work continued to inspire change, not just in New York City but across the country. His story had spread far and wide, becoming a symbol of the power of empathy, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Leroy never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the struggles that had shaped him, nor the people who still suffered on the streets. But now, he had a platform. Now, he had a voice. And with that voice, he vowed to keep fighting, for justice, for equality, and for the dignity of all people. Sergeant Henderson and Officer Stevens remained by his side, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They had learned from their mistakes, and they had become better men because of them. Together, they forged a new path, a path that bridged the gap between the uniform and the civilian, between authority and compassion. It wasn't always easy, and there were plenty of setbacks along the way. But they never gave up, and in the end, that was what made all the difference.